In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. We've all heard that line, whispered like a prayer, repeated like a mantra across a million worlds. But what if you couldn't escape it? Not just for one lifetime, not even for 10 lifetimes, but for all of recorded human history and beyond. What if you were condemned to watch empires rise and fall, to see everyone you've ever loved turn to dust, to witness humanity's greatest triumphs and most crushing defeats, over and over again, for 45,000 years? This is not the story of heroes who embrace immortality with open arms. This is not about warriors who stride boldly into eternity, eager for endless glory. This is about the immortals who ran, the ones who hid, the ones who tried to die but couldn't, the perpetual cowards of Warhammer 40,000. Immortality, in most fiction, is portrayed as the ultimate gift, the fountain of youth, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life. But in the nightmare universe of Warhammer 40K, immortality is a curse that makes damnation look merciful. Because when you live forever in a galaxy where there is only war, you don't just fight one battle, you fight every battle. You don't just lose one home, you lose them all. You don't just mourn one generation, you mourn every generation, stretching back into the mists of prehistory and forward into an apocalyptic future that never quite arrives. The perpetuals of Warhammer 40,000 are beings cursed with biological immortality. They cannot age. They cannot truly die. Burn them to ash and they'll regenerate. Blast them into atoms and they'll reassemble. Throw them into the cold void of space and they'll eventually find themselves on solid ground again, alive and whole. Their cellular regeneration is so rapid, so efficient, that death itself cannot claim them. They are living violations of the natural order, trapped in flesh that refuses to fail them. But here's the thing about immortality that the legends never tell you. It's not just about living forever. It's about remembering forever. It's about carrying the weight of millennia in a mind that was never designed to hold so much history, so much pain, so much loss. It's about watching the world change around you while you remain frozen, a relic of ages past, increasingly out of place in every new era that dawns. And in Warhammer 40K, where the very fabric of reality is torn by the psychic screams of tortured souls, where gods of pure malevolence feast on mortal suffering, where entire worlds are consumed by flames and entire species are driven to extinction. What does it mean to be unable to die? What does it mean to be condemned to witness all of it, powerless to stop the inexorable march toward oblivion? For some perpetuals, it meant trying to guide humanity toward a brighter future. For others, it meant attempting to seize power and reshape civilization in their own image. But for a few, a precious few, it meant something else entirely. It meant running. It meant hiding. It meant trying, desperately, futilely, to escape a burden they never asked for and could never put down. This is their story. The story of the immortal cowards of Warhammer 40,000. The ones who saw the horrors of the galaxy and said no. The ones who turned their backs on destiny and tried to carve out a few moments of peace in a universe that offers none. The ones who discovered that cowardice, when you're immortal, is just another form of suffering. The nature of the perpetual, biology's cruelest joke. Before we can understand why anyone would want to escape immortality, we need to understand what it means to be a perpetual in the Warhammer universe. These beings are not vampires sustained by blood, not liches clinging to existence through dark sorcery, not ancient spirits possessing new bodies. They are, in the most fundamental sense, still human. Just humans who cannot die. The scientific explanation, such as it exists in a universe where science and sorcery blur together, points to an extraordinary mutation in human evolution. Perpetuals possess cellular regeneration capabilities that operate at speeds and efficiencies that make normal human healing look glacial by comparison. When a perpetual suffers an injury, Their cells immediately begin repairing the damage, not over days or weeks, but over hours or even minutes. A broken bone that would sideline a normal human for months might heal in a perpetual in days. A wound that would kill an ordinary person becomes merely an inconvenience. Even injuries that should be instantly fatal, dismemberment, decapitation, total organ failure, are temporary setbacks. The perpetual's body simply rebuilds itself from whatever remains, or in some cases, from seemingly nothing at all. There are documented cases of perpetuals surviving total disintegration. Thrown into a plasma furnace and reduced to scattered atoms, they somehow reassemble. Cast into the void of space, where exposure to hard, radiation and freezing temperatures should end any form of life, they eventually regenerate on the nearest habitable surface. It's as if their very essence, some fundamental pattern of what they are, persists beyond the physical destruction of their body, and slowly, inevitably, rebuilds that body from scratch. But this regeneration is not clean. It's not pleasant. It's not the instantaneous healing of a fantasy world. Every injury still hurts. Every death is still experienced. When John Grammaticus stepped out of an airlock without a spacesuit, he felt every agonizing second of asphyxiation. He felt his lungs rupture from decompression. He felt his blood boil in his veins. He felt his consciousness fade into the black. And then, hours or days or weeks later, he woke up, alive, whole, and haunted by the memory of dying. This is the true horror of being a perpetual. You can't escape pain through death. You can only delay it, accumulate it, collect it like a miser hoarding coins, until your mind is a vault stuffed with every agony you've ever experienced. Other humans get the mercy of forgetting their pain, their traumas fading with time or ending definitively with death. Perpetuals forget nothing. Their minds are as enduring as their bodies, perfect archives of suffering. The origin of perpetuals remains shrouded in mystery, even to themselves. Some, like Olania's person, appear to have been born this way, natural mutations that arose in the earliest days of human civilization. Others suggest that perpetuals represent the next step in human evolution, Homo superior as they styled themselves, destined to guide baseline humanity towards some greater future. One ancient perpetual named Erda theorized that they arose naturally, spontaneous mutations in the human genome that conferred immortality. In the deep past, when humanity was young and the world was still being shaped, these immortals took positions of power. They became the god-kings of legend, the warlords, and emperors whose reign stretched across centuries. They shaped human civilization from the shadows, guiding it, or trying to, toward outcomes only they could envision. But there's another type of perpetual, the manufactured ones. The Cabal, a mysterious organization of ancient Xenos species, developed technology capable of transforming ordinary humans into perpetuals. John Grammaticus was one such creation, killed in battle during the Unification Wars on Terra, then resurrected by an Eldar autarch and granted the curse of immortality in exchange for his service. For these manufactured perpetuals, immortality wasn't a birthright. It was a transaction, a deal made in desperation or ignorance, whose true cost wouldn't become apparent until centuries had passed and everyone they'd ever known had long since turned to dust. They didn't grow up immortal, learning to cope with their nature over millennia. They were thrust into it, traumatically transformed from mortal to eternal in a single, violent moment. Both types of perpetuals share one thing in common. They can be killed, but only by very specific means. Conventional weapons, even those capable of completely destroying their bodies, won't permanently end them. But there exists a substance called fulgurite, formed when the Emperor of Mankind's psychic lightning fused sand on certain worlds during the Great Crusade. This material retains a portion of the Emperor's immense power, and it's one of the few things capable of overcoming a perpetual's regeneration and killing them permanently. The existence of fulgurite is telling. It suggests that even in their immortality, perpetuals aren't truly invincible. There is an escape hatch, a way out, a final death if they can obtain it. And for some perpetuals, the knowledge that such a thing exists becomes an obsession. Not because they want power over other immortals, but because they want power over themselves. The power to choose when enough is enough. Living forever sounds appealing until you actually think about what it means. You'll outlive your parents. Obviously, everyone does that. You'll outlive your children. Tragic, but it happens. You'll outlive your children's children, and their children, and their children's children, watching your bloodline branch out across generations until the people who carry your genes are so distantly related, they might as well be strangers. You'll outlive your nation. You'll outlive your civilization. You'll outlive entire epochs of human history. You'll forget what your mother's face looked like, not because you want to, but because human memory, even enhanced perpetual memory, has limits. After 10,000 years, after 20,000, after 45,000 years, the details start to blur. The people you loved become vague impressions. The places you called home exist only in fragments of recollection. You become a walking ghost, haunted by a past you can no longer fully remember, but can never truly escape. And in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where war is constant and civilization repeatedly collapses into chaos, only to be painfully rebuilt, the weight of that history becomes almost unbearable. You don't just remember peace and plenty, you remember the age of strife, when human civilization collapsed and psykers began spontaneously manifesting across the galaxy, their uncontrolled powers tearing holes in reality and letting demons flood through. You remember Old Night, when warp storms made interstellar travel impossible and isolated human colonies fell one by one to Xenos predators and internal strife. You remember everything humanity has lost, the golden age of technology, when humans commanded powers that would make the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with envy. The age of reason, when science and learning flourished. The age of hope, when the stars beckoned with promise instead of threat. All of it gone, crushed under the weight of mankind's ambitions and mistakes. And you were there to see it happen. You were there, powerless to stop it, forced to watch as everything you'd helped build crumbled into ruin. This is what it means to be a perpetual. This is the curse that these immortal beings carry. And for some of them, the burden became too much to bear. They looked at eternity stretching out before them and made a choice. They would hide, they would run, they would try to carve out a few moments of peace in a galaxy that knows only war. They would become cowards, if that's what it took to preserve what little remained of their humanity. The oldest coward, Olanius Person's 45,000-year flight. If there's one name that embodies the immortal coward of Warhammer 40,000, it's Olanius Person. Ol, as he preferred to be called, claimed to be approximately 45,000 years old, give or take a few centuries. If his estimation is accurate, and there's no reason to doubt it given his intimate knowledge of events from the deepest reaches of human history, that would make him older than the emperor of mankind himself. Think about that for a moment. 45,000 years, the entire span of recorded human history, from the earliest cave paintings to the present day, is maybe 10 to 12,000 years. Olanius Person had lived through more than 4 times that length. He was born before the invention of writing, before the rise of the first cities, before agriculture transformed human society. He was already ancient when the pyramids were built. He was already tired when Rome fell. By the time the Great Crusade began in the 30th millennium, he had seen more than any human mind was ever meant to hold. And what did he do with all that time? He fought, over and over again, across different eras, different wars, different causes. He fought. The historical record, as Ol himself recounted it, is staggering in its scope. He was one of the Argonauts, sailing with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece in Greek mythology. He fought at the Battle of Austerlitz in the Napoleonic Wars. He was in the trenches at Verdun during World War I, one of the bloodiest battles in human history, where men died by the thousands in muddy hell. He fought in the Gulf War, witnessing the transition to modern mechanized warfare. But these were just the battles from our history, the conflicts of old Earth in the distant past. Old Person also fought in wars we can barely imagine. He served in the Imperial Army during the Unification Wars, when the man who would become the Emperor of mankind conquered terror and united humanity under his rule. He witnessed the dawn of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor launched his fleets into the stars to reclaim the scattered worlds of mankind. Through all of it, Olanius Person was never a general, never a leader, never one of the great heroes whose names are carved in stone and celebrated in song. He was always a grunt, a common soldier, a trooper in the ranks. Where the Emperor took on the roles of kings and conquerors throughout history, Ol Person was content to be nobody. Ola Person, Olivier Person, Oliver Nobody. The name itself was a joke, a pun on his desire to remain unremarkable. There's a pattern here, and it's not coincidence. Olanius Person deliberately chose obscurity. He could have leveraged his immortality to accumulate power and wealth. With 45,000 years to work with, he could have become the richest man on any world, accumulated knowledge that would make him invaluable to any ruler, positioned himself at the heights of human civilization. Instead, he chose to be a soldier, replaceable, forgettable, anonymous. Why? Because soldiers can disappear. When a war ends, soldiers go home, fade into civilian life, become civilians again. No one tracks them. No one questions where they went or what happened to them. It's the perfect cover for an immortal trying to avoid attention. Fight for a few years, accumulate enough service credit to retire, then vanish before anyone notices you're not aging like everyone else around you. This pattern repeated throughout Olanius Person's life. He would serve, fight bravely but not too bravely, survive through a combination of skill and his natural regeneration, then retire and disappear into obscurity until the next conflict found him. And there was always a next conflict. In a universe where there is only war, peace is just the interval between battles. But there's another reason Ol chose to be a soldier, a darker reason that speaks to the psychology of an immortal in a mortal world. Soldiers expect to die. That's the nature of warfare. You send men into battle knowing some won't come back. So when Olanius Person survived yet another campaign that killed most of his comrades, no one thought it was miraculous. They thought he was lucky. And luck runs out eventually, so the thinking went. No one suspected that his luck was actually biological immortality. The irony is almost painful. Olanius Person, who couldn't die, spent much of his existence in situations where death was most likely. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death over and over again, and the shadow could never touch him. While men around him fell to bullets and bombs and blades, he alone would walk away, carrying the weight of their loss, adding it to the ever-growing burden of guilt that all survivors carry. Imagine surviving Verdun. That single battle lasted 10 months and killed over 300,000 men. The mud was mixed with blood and body parts. The air was thick with gas and smoke. Men died in their thousands, cut down by machine gun fire, or blown apart by artillery, or drowned in shell craters filled with contaminated water. Olanius Person fought in that hell and walked away. While the men he'd served beside, laughed with, shared rations with, died screaming in the mud, he lived. And then he had to do it again, and again, and again. Different wars, different weapons, different enemies, but always the same result. Everyone else died. He lived. The guilt alone would drive a normal person mad. But perpetuals don't get the luxury of madness, not really. Their minds are as resilient as their bodies. They endure, they remember, they carry it all. By the time the 31st millennium rolled around, Olanius Person had earned his retirement many times over. He'd served in the Imperial Army during the Great Crusade, fighting to bring lost human worlds back into the fold of the Imperium. He'd accumulated enough service shares, the payment soldiers received based on years served, to claim land on any number of worlds. He chose Calth, an agricultural world in the Ultramar system, and he chose to be a farmer. 20 hectares. That's all he asked for. A modest plot of land where he could grow crops and live quietly. No glory, no adventure, no battles. Just the simple, honest work of tending soil and watching things grow. After 45,000 years of war, Olanius Persson wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He settled into his new life with the deliberate care of someone trying to disappear. He kept to himself mostly, though he employed a few workers to help with the farm. His only real companion was Graft, an old servitor, a human converted into a cyborg slave that had served with him in the Imperial army and refused to stop calling him Trooper Persson. To his neighbors, he was just Pious Ol, an eccentric old farmer with a stubborn religious faith in the Catholic religion, an anachronism in an age when the imperial truth demanded atheism. His faith is worth examining because it reveals something about Olanius Persson's character. Catholicism was ancient even by the standards of the 31st millennium, a relic of a religious age that the emperor had deliberately tried to eradicate. The imperial truth proclaimed that there were no gods, that religion was superstition best left behind. Yet Ol Persson clung to his faith, practiced it openly despite the risk, because it was one of the few constants in his long life. When everything else changes, when civilizations rise and fall, and the very stars seem to shift in the heavens, there's comfort in ritual, in prayers that have been spoken for tens of thousands of years, in beliefs that have survived every attempt to stamp them out. Olanius Persson's Catholicism wasn't just faith, it was an anchor, a connection to the deep past, a reminder that some things persist even when everything else is swept away. For 18 years, Olanius Persson lived on Calth as a simple farmer. 18 years of peace, the longest stretch of quiet he'd experienced in recent memory. He woke with the sun, tended his crops, dealt with the mundane problems of agricultural life. Soil pH levels and irrigation schedules instead of tactics and enemy positions. Crop yields instead of casualty reports. It was gloriously, blessedly boring. He was hiding, of course. He'd hidden before, many times over the millennia. After every war, after every conflict, he would find a quiet corner of the world and try to pretend he was normal. Try to live a life that had some meaning beyond survival and combat. It never lasted. War always found him. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe on Calth, at the far edge of the Imperium under the watchful protection of the Ultramarines Legion and their Primarch Robut Gilliman, he could finally have the peace he'd sought for 45,000 years. He should have known better. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace. There is only war. And on the planet Calth, war was coming in the form of betrayal on a scale that would shake the very foundations of the Imperium. When the Wordbearer's Legion attacked Calth without warning, turning brother against brother in the opening moves of the Horus Heresy, Olanius Persson's retirement ended abruptly. The skies burned, cities died, millions perished in the initial assault as the Wordbearers unleashed their fury on a world that had thought itself safe. Ol Persson survived, of course. He always survived. But his farm was gone, his quiet life shattered, his attempt at peace revealed as the futile gesture it had always been. He could have surrendered to it, could have accepted that he was a soldier, that war was his destiny, that he would never escape the cycle of violence that had defined his existence. Instead, he did something that could be seen as either cowardly or wise. He ran. When John Grammaticus, another perpetual and an agent of the mysterious Cabal, contacted him psychically and told him about a mission of cosmic importance, about the need to reach Terra and stop the Horus Heresy before it consumed the galaxy, Olanius Persson gathered a group of survivors from the ruins of Calth and fled, not toward the battle, away from it. He used an athame, a ritual dagger with the power to cut through reality itself, to open portals through space and time. He and his companions, Ordinary humans who'd had the misfortune of surviving the Word-Bearer's attack began a journey through the warp, through different periods of history, trying to reach Terra before it was too late. They traveled through time, witnessing different eras of human history, always pursued by demonic forces and the Word-Bearers who wanted to stop them. It was a flight, a retreat, a desperate attempt to avoid direct confrontation for as long as possible. Old Person, the man who had fought in countless wars across 45 millennia, spent much of the Horus heresy running away, leading his little band of refugees through the back roads of reality, trying to keep them alive, trying to complete his mission without having to face the full horror of what the galaxy had become. Some would call this cowardice. The greatest crisis in human history was unfolding. Brother fighting brother, the Imperium tearing itself apart, and one of its oldest defenders was running away from the fight. But cowardice is a complex thing when you're immortal, when you've already fought more battles than any human should have to fight, when you've already sacrificed more than anyone should have to sacrifice. Is it really cowardice to want to avoid one more war? Or is it wisdom? Is it the hard-earned knowledge that violence rarely solves anything, that wars create more problems than they solve, that the cycle of vengeance and retribution has no end? Olanius Person had seen the futility of war played out across millennia. He'd watched conflicts that seemed vitally important at the time fade into obscure footnotes in history. He'd seen causes men died for become forgotten or discredited. He knew better than anyone that war's glory is a lie. So he ran. Not because he was a coward, though he would have accepted that label if it meant keeping his companions alive, but because he knew something that only someone who'd lived 45,000 years could know. That survival is its own form of victory. That living to fight another day isn't weakness. It's the only strategy that works when you have forever to play the long game, the psychology of eternal witness. To understand the immortal coward, we need to understand what happens to the human mind when it's forced to operate across timescales it was never designed for. The human brain evolved to handle a lifespan of maybe 40 to 60 years. Our memory systems, our emotional processing, our entire psychological architecture assumes a mortal time frame. We're built to forget, to move on, to let the past fade so we can focus on the present and future. Perpetuals don't get that mercy. Their enhanced biology doesn't just preserve their bodies, it preserves their minds with disturbing clarity. They remember. Not everything, human memory has limits, even in an enhanced brain, but far more than any mortal could retain. And what they remember most clearly are the worst moments, the traumas, the losses, the horrors they've witnessed. This is a fundamental truth about memory that applies even to normal humans. We remember negative experiences more vividly than positive ones, because from an evolutionary perspective, remembering danger keeps us alive. Your brain doesn't need to remember every pleasant meal you've eaten, but it absolutely needs to remember the time you ate something that made you violently ill. Trauma burns itself into memory in a way that joy doesn't. For perpetuals, this means that across millennia of existence, what accumulates most readily is pain. The happy moments fade first, their details becoming soft and indistinct. But the terrible moments remain sharp. Every friend who died in battle, every lover who aged and withered while you remained unchanged, every child you watched grow old and die, every civilization you watched collapse, every hope you saw crushed, all of it preserved in exquisite detail, a museum of suffering that you carry with you everywhere you go. The psychological term for what happens when someone experiences or witnesses traumatic events is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD manifests in various ways: hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbness, difficulty forming attachments, a persistent sense that danger is imminent. Now imagine PTSD compounded across 45,000 years. Trauma layered upon trauma, layered upon trauma, until your entire psychology is shaped by wounds that never heal, because you never forget what caused them. Ollanius Persson fought at Verdun. The Battle of Verdun was designed to bleed France white, a deliberate strategy of attrition, where the goal was to kill so many French soldiers that France would be forced to surrender. Men died in industrial quantities, not because it served any tactical purpose, but simply to create corpses. To be there, to see that level of mechanized slaughter, to watch human beings fed into a meat grinder and turned into casualties on a spreadsheet would traumatize anyone. But Ole Persson didn't just witness Verdun. He witnessed every major conflict in human history. He saw the Argonauts sail into legend. He watched Napoleon's armies march across Europe. He was there when nuclear weapons were first used. He saw the age of strife consume human civilization. He watched the Emperor's Great Crusade reconquer the galaxy through force of arms. Battle after battle, war after war, century after century, millennium after millennium. How does a mind cope with that? How do you process that much death? How do you maintain any sense of hope or meaning when you've seen humanity make the same mistakes over and over again for 45,000 years? The answer is, you don't. Not really. You find ways to cope, mechanisms for survival, but you're never okay. You can't be okay. No one could be okay after witnessing that much horror. Some perpetuals cope by distancing themselves emotionally. They stop forming attachments because attachments mean loss, and loss means pain. They become cold, calculating, treating the mortals around them as temporary fixtures in an eternal landscape. The Emperor of Mankind exemplifies this approach, seeing even his own sons, the Primarchs, as tools to be used for the greater good of humanity, rather than individuals worthy of love and respect. Others cope by retreating into specific roles or identities. If you can define yourself by what you do rather than who you know, then the loss of people becomes more bearable. You're not losing friends and family. You're just seeing one generation of soldiers replaced by another. The mission continues, even if the individuals change. This was partly Ollanius Persson's strategy. Being a soldier meant being part of something larger than himself, something that transcended individual relationships. But there's another coping mechanism that some perpetuals embrace: hiding. If you can't stop the pain, you can at least minimize your exposure to it. Stay away from major, historical events. Don't get involved in the grand schemes and cosmic conflicts. Keep your head down, live quietly, and maybe you can carve out a few centuries of relative peace before the next catastrophe finds you. This is the coward's strategy, and it's easy to condemn it as selfish. But consider what it actually represents. It's a recognition that one individual, even an immortal one, cannot save the world. It's an acceptance that some problems are too large to solve through direct action. It's a decision to preserve your own sanity and humanity in the face of an uncaring universe that will grind on with or without your participation. John Grammaticus, another perpetual we'll examine in more detail, spent time in an asylum. 18 years of his 1,000-year existence were spent institutionalized, presumably because the weight of his experiences had broken something in his mind that needed time to repair. The fact that even perpetuals can go mad, that even they're enhanced, psychology has breaking points, tells us something important about the burden they carry. Madness, in a sense, is a mercy. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable truth by retreating into fantasy or delusion. But perpetuals don't get to stay mad. Their regeneration applies to their minds as well as their bodies. Given enough time, they heal mentally as well as physically. The madness fades, clarity returns, and with it, the full weight of memory comes crashing back. Imagine recovering from a mental breakdown only to remember clearly everything that drove you to break in the first place. No reprieve, no forgetting, no soft dimming of traumatic memories. Just the same stark clarity you had before, with the additional trauma of madness itself layered on top. This is what healing means for a perpetual, and it's almost crueler than staying broken. There's also the isolation to consider. When you're immortal, and everyone around you is mortal, relationships become fraught. With an expiration date you can see coming but they can't. You meet someone, maybe even fall in love. You know from the start that they'll age and die while you remain unchanged. Every moment of happiness is shadowed by the knowledge of its inevitable end. Some perpetuals try to avoid this by only forming relationships with other perpetuals, but there aren't many of them, and they don't always get along. The Emperor tried to recruit every perpetual on Earth to his cause, but many refused or actively opposed him. The few that agreed to help eventually left or betrayed him. Even immortals, perhaps especially immortals, struggle to maintain lasting relationships when the timescales involved are measured in millennia. So what do? Do you love anyway, knowing you'll lose everyone you care about? Do you hold yourself apart, protecting yourself from pain by refusing connection? Or do you hide, deliberately choosing obscurity and isolation because at least that's a kind of control you can exercise over your circumstances? Ollanius Persson tried all three approaches at various points in his life. He had relationships, lost them, mourned them. He held himself apart during certain eras, going through the motions of existence without really engaging with the people around him. And repeatedly, across his 45,000-year existence, he hid, disappeared into anonymous obscurity, became nobody in particular, just another face in the crowd, unremarkable and forgettable. Was this cowardice, or was it the only sane response to an insane situation? When you've lived long enough to see the patterns repeat, to know that this war will end and another will begin, to understand that your participation won't fundamentally change the outcome, what's the point of fighting? What's the point of suffering? Why not hide, preserve yourself, and wait for the storm to pass? The accusation of cowardice assumes that courage is always the right choice, that standing and fighting is morally superior to fleeing. But courage in the service of futility is just another kind of waste. Ollanius Persson had been courageous for 45,000 years. He'd fought more battles than any normal human could imagine. He'd proven his courage so many times that proving it again was meaningless. What he wanted, what he needed, was something courage couldn't give him: peace, rest, a cessation of the endless cycle of violence that defined the galaxy. So he hid, he farmed, he practiced his anachronistic faith. He tried to be nobody in particular on a backwater agricultural world, far from the centers of power and conflict. And when war came anyway, as it always did, he ran. He used his athame to cut through reality itself and flee into the depths of time and space, with a handful of refugees who looked to him for protection. This is the psychology of the immortal coward. Not a lack of courage, but an abundance of weariness. Not fear of death, which holds no real terror for someone who cannot die, but fear of more loss, more pain, more pointless sacrifice. It's the psychology of someone who's been broken so many times that the pieces don't fit together quite right anymore, and who's decided that maybe, just maybe, it's okay to walk away from the next battle. The suicide attempt. John Grammaticus and the prison of flesh. If Ollanius Persson represents the coward who runs, John Grammaticus represents something even darker. The coward who wants to die, but can't. His story reveals another dimension of immortality's curse. What happens when your eternal life is something you never asked for, something that was forced upon you, and something you actively want to escape? John Grammaticus was born mortal on Terra, near the close of the 29th millennium, during the Unification Wars when the Emperor was conquering Earth and bringing its warring factions under his rule. He served as a line officer in the Caucasian levies, an army that allied with the Emperor during those brutal conflicts. He was, by all accounts, a skilled soldier and a natural psyker with a unique gift, logokinesis. He could understand any language, no matter how alien or obscure, and could unlock the inherent power that words themselves contained. This ability made him valuable, and that value would prove to be his curse. During a victory ceremony after the Imperial forces defeated the Pan-Pacific Empire, John Grammaticus briefly met the Emperor. The meeting was momentous, even if brief. The Emperor recognized Grammaticus as a man somewhat like himself, a psyker of unusual ability. He suggested they should talk further, to consider the options available to beings like us. But that conversation never happened. Before they could meet again, John Grammaticus died. He was killed at Anatole Hive in combat, a casualty of the Unification Wars, like countless thousands of others. His story should have ended there, another name forgotten in the annals of Terra's blood-soaked history. Instead, it became something far worse. An Eldar autarch named Slaudar found Grammaticus's body and brought him back to life. Not as a ghost or a revenant, but as a perpetual, an artificially created immortal. The resurrection was the work of the Cabal, a mysterious organization of ancient Xenos species who had opposed the forces of chaos for millennia. They had technology capable of transforming dead humans into perpetuals, and they needed John Grammaticus for their own purposes. The Cabal offered him a deal, or perhaps imposed one upon him. The details are murky. He would serve as their agent, using his unique linguistic abilities to further their goals. In exchange, he received immortality, the ability to reincarnate after death, to come back again and again no matter what killed him. It sounded like a gift. It was actually a prison sentence, with no possibility of parole. Think about what this means. John Grammaticus didn't grow up immortal. He wasn't born a perpetual, learning to cope with his nature over centuries of gradual adaptation. He was a mortal man who died, then was forced back into life with powers he never asked for and a master he never chose. His immortality wasn't his. It belonged to the Cabal, and so did he. For 1,000 years, John Grammaticus served the Cabal. 1,000 years of missions, manipulations, and schemes. He was their translator, their diplomat, their spy. He recruited the Alpha Legion to their cause during the early days of the Horus heresy, showing Alfarius a vision of the future where humanity's extinction would doom the Chaos Gods. He infiltrated Imperial forces, betrayed allies, and advanced an alien agenda that he didn't fully understand or agree with. The Cabal believed they were fighting for the greater good, working to defeat chaos even if it meant sacrificing humanity. But John Grammaticus was human. No matter how long he lived, no matter what alien masters he served, he couldn't escape his fundamental connection to his own species. Everything the Cabal asked him to do felt like betrayal. Every mission that harmed humanity chipped away at his soul. The guilt accumulated year after year until it became unbearable. So he tried to die. John Grammaticus walked out of an airlock on a Cabal spacecraft, just opened the door and stepped into hard vacuum without a spacesuit, without any protection, with nothing but the desperate hope that maybe this would be enough. Maybe the cold of space, the absence of oxygen, the radiation and pressure differential would finally end him. Maybe he could escape the prison of his flesh through the mercy of oblivion. He died, of course. Asphyxiation in vacuum is brutally quick. His lungs ruptured from explosive decompression. His blood boiled as pressure dropped. His body froze solid in the absolute cold of space. He felt all of it, every agonizing second. And then he felt nothing at all. Peace, darkness, the end he'd been seeking. And then he came back. Hours later, or maybe days, John Grammaticus woke up on a habitable surface. Alive, whole. His body had regenerated from the scattered particles of his frozen corpse, somehow reassembling itself and transporting to the nearest stable environment. His manufactured immortality had done exactly what it was designed to do: deny him the release of death. This is a horror beyond normal comprehension. Imagine wanting to die, choosing to die, experiencing death, and then being denied even that final escape. Imagine the despair of waking up after your suicide attempt, not in a hospital where you could try again, but in perfect health, with the certain knowledge that trying again won't work. You cannot kill yourself. You cannot escape yourself. You are condemned to exist, no matter what you want. The futility of it must have been crushing. John Grammaticus had endured 1,000 years of service to alien masters, accumulating guilt and trauma until his psyche could no longer bear the weight. The only way out seemed to be death, and even death wouldn't take him. He was trapped, not just in the service of the Cabal, but in existence itself. His manufactured immortality differed from natural perpetuals in key ways. Where someone like Olanius Person regenerated relatively quickly and stayed in essentially the same body, John Grammaticus's resurrection seemed to require the Cabal's intervention, or at least their technology. He died, his body was recovered, or his essence was somehow preserved, and then he came back to life through a process he didn't control and didn't fully understand. This lack of control is crucial. A natural, perpetual, at least, has agency over their own resurrection. It happens automatically, a biological process they can rely on. But John Grammaticus's immortality was conditional, dependent on systems and powers beyond himself. He couldn't even die properly, without permission, from the beings who'd enslaved him to eternal life. The suicide attempt revealed something important about John Grammaticus's character. He wasn't brave, at least not in the traditional sense. He didn't want to fight anymore, didn't want to betray anyone else, didn't want to serve anyone's cause. He just wanted it to stop. All of it. The missions, the guilt, the endless march of years. He wanted the peace that only death could bring, and he was willing to endure the agony of vacuum exposure to get it. This is different from Olanius Person's brand of cowardice. Ol ran from conflict but still engaged with life. He farmed, practiced his faith, tried to build something meaningful even if temporary. John Grammaticus wanted to opt out entirely. His suicide attempt was the ultimate retreat, a final desperate flight from existence itself. When running away in life isn't enough, when hiding can't protect you from yourself, the only escape left is death. But he couldn't even have that. After his failed suicide, John Grammaticus continued his service to the Cabal, because what choice did he have? He couldn't die. He couldn't escape. All he could do was endure, carrying the weight of his existence like a punishment, like a curse that had no end. Eventually, the Cabal assigned him another mission, one that would require him to betray humanity yet again. Find the Primarch Vulcan, who was also a perpetual, and kill him with the Fulgurite, the only weapon capable of permanently ending a perpetual's life. The mission brought John Grammaticus face to face with a terrible temptation. He held in his hands the only substance in the galaxy capable of killing him permanently. The Fulgurite could do what vacuum exposure could not, grant him true and final death. All he had to do was turn it on himself instead of Vulcan. But he didn't. Not yet. Because despite everything, despite the horror of his existence and the weight of his guilt, John Grammaticus still had some shred of duty or purpose, or maybe just inertia keeping him going. He confronted Vulcan, another perpetual, who'd been driven mad by torture at the hands of the Night Haunter, Conrad Kurz. In a moment of decision, Grammaticus chose to use the Fulgurite to heal Vulcan, rather than kill him or himself. The choice cost him his immortality. Using the Fulgurite that way somehow burned out his perpetual nature, reducing him from an eternal being to an ordinary mortal. His next death would be permanent. After 1,000 years of wanting to die but being unable to, John Grammaticus finally became capable of dying again. The prison of his flesh had been opened. He was free, except he wasn't, not really, because the Cabal still had one more mission for him, and they made sure he would complete it. Daemon Praetanis, another perpetual in the Cabal's service, effectively took him prisoner and held him until the final task could be completed. Even mortality wasn't enough to escape the obligations he'd taken on. John Grammaticus's story illustrates a particular kind of cowardice, the cowardice of someone who wants to surrender but isn't allowed to. In war, surrender is usually an option, even if not a good one. You can throw down your weapons, raise your hands, and accept captivity or death. But when you're immortal, especially when your immortality is controlled by others, there is no surrender. You cannot lay down the burden. You cannot quit. You can only continue, day after day, year after year, century after century, until something finally breaks. His suicide attempt wasn't an act of bravery. It wasn't a noble sacrifice or a heroic last stand. It was despair made manifest, the action of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of what they could endure and chose oblivion over one more day of existence. That's not heroism. That's defeat. That's cowardice in its purest form, choosing not to fight anymore because fighting has become unbearable. And yet, there's something almost pitiable about it. John Grammaticus wasn't trying to escape responsibility for crimes he'd committed, though. He'd committed plenty. He wasn't trying to avoid facing consequences for his actions. He was trying to escape the unendurable weight of existence itself, to find peace in the only way that seemed available to him. When life becomes torture, and there's no possibility of it ever improving, is wanting it to end really cowardice? Or is it the only rational response? The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is unimaginably cruel. It's a universe where suffering is constant, where hope is a lie, where the best you can realistically aim for is a quick death rather than a slow one. For mortals, that's terrible enough. But for immortals, for beings condemned to experience that cruelty forever, it's worse than any hell. John Grammaticus looked at eternity in that nightmare and said no. He chose death, or tried to, and the universe wouldn't even grant him that mercy. What do you call someone who wants to stop fighting but isn't allowed to? A coward, a prisoner, a victim, maybe all three. John Grammaticus was an immortal coward, not because he lacked courage, though he did, but because courage had ceased to matter. When you can't die and can't escape and can't change your circumstances, courage is just another form of suffering. Better to be a coward, to want it all to end, to dream of peace, even if peace is impossible. This is the true horror of manufactured immortality. It's not just that you live forever, it's that your forever belongs to someone else. You're a tool, a resource, a thing to be used. And the ultimate irony is that the gift that was supposed to preserve you becomes the chains that bind you. John Grammaticus was saved from death only to discover that salvation was another word for damnation. The ultimate betrayal, Erda's flight into exile. While Alanius Persson ran from war and John Grammaticus ran from life itself, another perpetual chose a different kind of flight, betrayal followed by hiding. Her name was Erda, and her actions shaped the course of human history in ways that make her simultaneously one of the most important and most reviled figures in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Erda was ancient, possibly as old as the Emperor himself, born in the earliest days of human civilization, when perpetuals existed as kings and warlords guiding nascent humanity. Unlike many of her kind who sought power and dominion, Erda was primarily interested in knowledge, genetics, evolution, the mechanisms by which humans might be elevated into something greater. When the man who would become the emperor began his campaign to unite and improve humanity, Erda joined him. Their relationship was complex, part intellectual partnership, part romantic entanglement, part shared mission. They worked together for millennia, with Erda serving as one of the emperor's chief geneticists and closest advisors. While other perpetuals eventually left the emperor's service, finding his methods too ruthless or his ambitions too grand, Erda stayed. She believed in the goal, even if she sometimes questioned the means. During the Unification Wars, when the emperor consolidated his control over Terra, he and Erda began work on what would become known as the Primarch Project. The goal was to create artificial perpetuals, superhumans who could serve as generals and leaders for humanity's expansion into the stars. 20 beings of immense power and ability, combining the Emperor's genes with Erda's to create the perfect synthesis of their respective strengths. Erda was, in a very real sense, the mother of the Primarchs, not just in the biological sense, though her genetic material was combined with the Emperor's to create them, but in the sense that she had helped design them, nurtured them through the early stages of development, poured her knowledge and skill into making them viable. They were her sons, as much as they were the Emperor's. But the Emperor had plans for these sons, plans that Erda found increasingly disturbing. He intended to use the Primarchs as generals in a grand crusade to conquer the galaxy, forcibly bringing scattered human worlds back under Imperial rule. The Primarchs would lead armies of space marines, genetically engineered super soldiers, created from their own gene seed, in campaigns of subjugation and slaughter that would span the stars. To Erda, this was a betrayal of everything the Primarch project was supposed to represent. She'd helped create these beings to guide humanity toward its evolutionary destiny, not to serve as warlords in a campaign of galactic conquest. She saw the Emperor's ambitions as proof that he'd lost sight of their original purpose, that he'd become too focused on power and control at the expense of humanity's true needs. So while the infant Primarchs were still being gestated in their development pods, before they'd had a chance to grow and become the weapons the Emperor intended, Erda did something that would echo through history. She used her considerable psychic power to create a warp, vortex that scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy. In an instant, 20 infant demigods were torn from their laboratories and cast across the stars to random worlds where they would grow up far from the Emperor's influence. It was an act of cosmic magnitude, literally changing the course of human history. If the Primarchs had grown up under the Emperor's guidance, if they'd been raised together as brothers with a shared purpose, the Horus heresy might never have happened. Horus might not have fallen to chaos. The Imperium might not have torn itself apart in civil war. Billions upon billions of lives might have been saved. But they didn't grow up together. They grew up scattered across the galaxy, raised by different cultures, shaped by different experiences. Some, like Robert Guilliman, ended up in relatively benign circumstances and grew into noble leaders. Others, like Angron, fell into brutal slavery and were twisted into monsters by their suffering. The Emperor's grand plan was shattered before it even began, and the blame rested squarely on Erda's shoulders. Or did it? Because according to Erebus, a word-bearer who would later confront Erda, she didn't act alone. The Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities of the warp who feast on mortal suffering, had manipulated her. They'd planted doubts, amplified her concerns, pushed her toward the decision to scatter the Primarchs because they foresaw what that action would lead to. The Horus heresy, the Imperium divided, eternal war, chaos triumphant. Whether Erda acted purely of her own will or was influenced by chaos is almost beside the point. What matters is what she did afterward. Having committed perhaps the greatest act of sabotage in human history, having betrayed the Emperor and destroyed his careful plans, Erda ran. She went into hiding, disappearing from the Emperor's side and retreating to obscurity. She could have stayed, could have faced the consequences of her actions, argued her case, tried to convince the Emperor that what she'd done was necessary. Instead, she fled. The Emperor, for his part, never retaliated against her, even though he knew where she was. Whether this was because he retained some affection for her, or because he'd foreseen that the current timeline of endless war was somehow preferable to the alternatives, or simply because he was too focused on trying to fix the disaster she'd caused, we don't know. But he didn't punish her. He let her hide. For tens of thousands of years, Erda lived in exile. By the time of the Horus heresy, she'd settled in Guelb, an ancient site in Mauritania close to her birthplace. She lived quietly, attended by her personal bodyguard, practicing the ancient arts she'd known for millennia. While the galaxy burned, while the suns she'd helped create tore each other apart, while the Imperium bled itself white in civil war, Erda hid. This is a different kind of cowardice than Alanius Person's retreat or John Grammaticus's suicide attempt. This is the cowardice of someone who acts decisively, alters the course of history, and then refuses to take responsibility for the consequences. Erda made a choice with her eyes open, a choice that doomed billions, and then ran from what she'd done. During the Siege of Terra, when the traitor legions had breached the Imperial Palace's defenses and were fighting for control of humanity's throne world, Erebus finally came for her. The word-bearer had his own agenda. He wanted to recruit her to Chaos's cause, to turn the mother of the Primarchs into a servant of the Dark Gods. He summoned 4 greater demons to force her submission, one from each of the 4 major Chaos gods. Erda refused, and in the battle that followed, she revealed her true power. She was a tripartite being, able to manifest 3 forms simultaneously: a dark-skinned woman wielding a staff, a crone capable of freezing anything she touched, and a youthful girl with a sickle. These 3 aspects of herself unleashed a tornado of psychic energy and destroyed all 4 greater demons. It was a display of power that few beings in the galaxy could match, but it exhausted her, left her wounded and vulnerable. Erebus, who'd stayed back during the demonic assault, approached with his Athame blade. He offered her one final chance to join Chaos, to worship him and embrace the powers that had manipulated her into scattering the Primarchs. Erda spat in his face. In response, Erebus stabbed her with the Athame, and because Athame blades are among the few weapons capable of permanently killing perpetuals, Erda died. Her long existence, her millennia of hiding, ended with a blade to the throat. There's an argument to be made that Erda wasn't a coward, that she acted from principle, believing genuinely that the Primarchs deserved freedom rather than servitude, that she lived in exile not out of fear, but out of conviction that her intervention had been necessary, that she died defiant, spitting in the face of chaos itself rather than surrendering to it. But there's a counter-argument that's harder to dismiss. If Erda really believed her actions were justified, why hide? Why not stay and argue her case? Why not work openly to mitigate the damage her decision had caused? Why retreat to obscurity while the galaxy burned? Her exile looks less like principled withdrawal and more like running from consequences she couldn't face. Consider what her choice cost. Angron, one of the scattered Primarchs, ended up enslaved on a brutal world where he was forced to fight in gladiatorial pits. He had crude surgery performed on his brain, the installation of the butcher's nails that caused him constant agony and drove him toward mindless violence. This was a being designed to be a leader, a general, a beacon of humanity's potential. Instead, he became a monster, and that monstrosity can be traced directly back to Erda's decision to scatter the Primarchs, or Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, who grew up on a crime-ridden world where violence was the only law. He became a brutal vigilante, terrorizing criminals through horrific violence, unable to conceive of justice in any other terms. His legion, the Night Lords, reflected his nature, becoming sadists who reveled in torture and fear. Another Primarch twisted by circumstances that need never have existed. The list goes on. Mortarion, Perturabo, Lorgar, all of them shaped by the random circumstances of where they ended up, rather than the careful guidance they were meant to receive. Some turned out well despite the disruption. Others were damaged in ways that made their eventual fall to chaos almost inevitable. And Erda, the woman responsible for all of it, hid in exile while her sons destroyed each other and the galaxy drowned in blood. This is perhaps the most damning form of immortal cowardice. Not the running from battle, which at least spares others from harm. Not the desire for death, which at least represents an endpoint, but the catastrophic action followed by retreat, the refusal to face what you've done, the hiding while others pay the price for your choices. Erda changed the course of history and then refused to participate in the history she'd created. When Erebus told her that Chaos had manipulated her, that the Dark Gods had nudged her toward her decision because they knew what it would lead to, did she reconsider her exile? Did she think maybe she should have stayed, should have worked to counter the very forces that had used her as a pawn? Or did she simply harden her conviction that she'd been right? that everyone else was wrong, that her hiding was justified because she'd acted from principle? We'll never know, because she died without reconciling with the Emperor, without facing her sons, without taking responsibility for the consequences of her betrayal. She lived in exile for millennia and died in exile, defiant to the end, but also isolated, alone, and ultimately ineffectual. Her power, which could destroy greater demons, was wasted in hiding. Her knowledge, which had helped create the Primarchs, was hoarded rather than used to help them. She preserved herself but contributed nothing, saved her own conscience at the cost of contributing to the galaxy's salvation. If courage means facing the consequences of your actions, then Erda's exile was cowardice in its purest form. She made a choice she believed was right, and then spent the rest of her existence running from what that choice had caused. She became an immortal coward, not through lack of power or ability, but through lack of will to engage with the catastrophe she'd helped create. The weight of memory, when forever becomes a prison. One of the cruelest aspects of being a perpetual in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is that your mind doesn't get the mercy of forgetting. While your body regenerates from any injury, your memory regenerates too, preserving traumas and horrors with perfect clarity across the millennia. This perfect recall becomes its own form of torture, a prison constructed from memories you can never escape. For mortal humans, memory fades with time. The sharp edges of grief soften. The intensity of fear diminishes. We forget the details of painful experiences, retaining only vague impressions. This isn't a flaw in human psychology, it's a feature. The ability to forget, to let go of the past, is what allows us to move forward. We couldn't function if every trauma remained as fresh and vivid as the day it happened. Perpetuals don't have that luxury. When Olanius Persson recalls the Battle of Verdun, he doesn't remember it as a distant historical event softened by time. He remembers it with the same visceral clarity as if it happened yesterday. The smell of gas, the sound of artillery, the sight of men dying in the mud, the feeling of his own body being torn apart by shrapnel, all of it preserved in exquisite detail, unable to fade, unable to be mercifully forgotten. Now multiply that across 45,000 years. Every battle, every loss, every friend who died, every lover who aged and withered while he remained unchanged. Every child he watched grow old and die. Every civilization he saw collapse. Every hope he saw crushed. All of it remembered with perfect clarity, creating a museum of suffering that fills his entire existence. The psychological term for persistent, intrusive memories of traumatic events is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It manifests in various ways: flashbacks, where past traumas feel present and immediate; hypervigilance, where you're constantly scanning for threats; emotional numbness as a defense mechanism against feeling too much; difficulty forming new attachments because you expect loss. These symptoms can be debilitating even from a single traumatic event. Now imagine PTSD compounded across 45,000 years of continuous trauma. That's what perpetuals live with. Every day. Forever. It's not just that they've experienced more than any human should have to experience. It's that they remember it all, and that memory is as sharp and cutting as the day the events happened. The weight of history becomes literally unbearable, pressing down on their consciousness with the force of millennia. This helps explain the various coping mechanisms perpetuals develop. Some, like the Emperor, become cold and calculating, deliberately distancing themselves emotionally from everyone around them. If you don't let yourself care, then loss doesn't hurt as much. If you treat people as tools rather than individuals, then their deaths become statistics rather than tragedies. It's cruel, but it's functional. It allows you to keep operating when empathy would paralyze you with grief. Others retreat into specific roles or identities that can survive loss. Olanius Persson, the soldier, wasn't attached to any particular unit or commander. He served, did his duty, And when his comrades died, he mourned them as fellow soldiers rather than as irreplaceable individuals. This isn't callousness, it's self-preservation. If every loss cuts you to the bone, you'll go mad from grief. Better to maintain some emotional distance, to participate in life without fully investing in it. Still others hide, like Erda in her exile or Alanius on his farm. If you can minimize your exposure to new trauma, if you can find a quiet corner of the galaxy and stay there, maybe the weight of memory becomes bearable. You're still carrying 45,000 years of pain, but at least you're not adding to it. At least you can have a few years, maybe even a few decades, where nothing terrible happens, and you're not forced to add new horrors to your collection. But hiding has its own costs. The memory doesn't just go away because you're not making new ones. It's still there, always, pressing down on you with inexorable weight. And the longer you hide, the harder it becomes to engage with the world again. You become accustomed to your isolation, your retreat from life. The thought of returning to conflict, to loss, to all the things that create new traumas becomes increasingly unbearable. This is how cowardice becomes not just a choice but a lifestyle. You start by retreating from one battle, just this once, because you can't face one more loss. Then you retreat from the next one, and soon you've retreated so far that coming back seems impossible. The coward's path becomes self-reinforcing. Each retreat makes the next retreat easier, and the thought of standing your ground harder. The memories themselves undergo a strange transformation over time. While they remain vivid, their context fades. Olanius' person remembers fighting at Verdun with perfect clarity. But does he remember why France and Germany were at war? Does he remember the complex web of alliances and political tensions that led to World War I? After 45,000 years and countless other wars, the specifics blur together. What remains is the visceral experience of combat, the trauma of violence, divorced from the meaning or purpose that might have justified it. This is particularly corrosive to morale. If you can remember fighting in dozens of wars but can't remember what most of them were about, what conclusion do you draw? That war itself is meaningless. That the causes men die for are forgotten while the dying endures. That nothing you fought for has lasted or mattered in any permanent way. This isn't just pessimism, it's empirical observation based on millennia of evidence. How do you maintain hope in the face of that? How do you convince yourself that this war, this cause, this sacrifice will be different from all the others that seemed important at the time but faded into irrelevance? The answer is, mostly you don't. You recognize that hope is a lie, that meaning is temporary, that everything ends in defeat or oblivion. And if you're wise, you stop caring quite so much about outcomes and focus instead on simple survival. This is what separates perpetual cowards from perpetual heroes. The heroes maintain the fiction that their actions matter, that this war is different, that they're fighting for something worth preserving. The Emperor embodies this approach, clinging to his vision of humanity's future, even as that vision repeatedly collapses into catastrophe. But cowards have abandoned that fiction. They've seen too much, remember too well, to believe in lasting victory. Is that cowardice, or is it honesty? Is the refusal to fight in a war you know will ultimately be meaningless a moral failing? Or is it the only sane response to an insane situation? The question haunts every perpetual who lives long enough to see the patterns repeat, to watch history's wheel turn through the same cycles of war and peace, rise and fall, hope and despair. The weight of memory also affects relationships in devastating ways. When you meet someone new, you can't help but compare them to people you've known before. This person reminds you of a friend who died at Verdun. That person's mannerisms echo a lover you had 10,000 years ago. Everything becomes a reminder of loss, a callback to pain, an echo of trauma. New relationships become difficult, not just because you know they'll end, but because they trigger memories of all the relationships that have already ended. Some perpetuals try to cope with this by keeping detailed records. Journals, memoirs, artifacts. anything to externalize memory and create some distance between themselves and their experiences. If the pain is written down, maybe it doesn't have to be carried inside you quite so much. But this strategy has its own problems. Reading about your own past becomes like reading about someone else, a stranger who happened to live in your body, whose experiences you remember but no longer feel connected to. Others try the opposite approach, deliberately trying to forget, to let the details fade, even if the broad strokes remain. This is what eventually happens to most perpetuals over time. The specific faces blur, the individual names are lost. What remains are generalities. War was horrible, love ended in loss, hope turned to ashes. These generalities are easier to carry than specific memories, but they're also more corrosive because they apply to everything. Every new war is just another war. Every new relationship is just another eventual loss. Everything becomes generic, drained of meaning and specificity. This is the final trap of immortal memory. Either you remember everything and go mad from the weight of it, or you forget enough to function but lose your connection to the meaning those memories once held. Either way, you're diminished. Either way, you're damaged in ways that can never heal, because healing would require forgetting. And you can't forget. Not really. Not permanently. The memories aren't just psychological, they're physiological. Trauma literally changes brain structure, altering how neurons connect and fire. PTSD isn't just emotional, it's neurological. For perpetuals, whose brains regenerate along with their bodies, this means that trauma becomes literally hardwired into their neurology. The pathways of pain and fear become so established that they operate automatically, beyond conscious control. This helps explain why some perpetuals seem emotionally flat or detached. It's not that they don't feel, it's that their trauma responses have become so habitual that they override normal emotional processing. Fear becomes the default state. Suspicion becomes automatic. Trust becomes nearly impossible because betrayal and loss are etched into every synapse. They're walking wounded, and their wounds are invisible but permanent. For those perpetuals who choose cowardice, the weight of memory provides all the justification they need. Every retreat is backed by 10,000 examples of why standing and fighting didn't work. Every act of hiding is supported by millennia of evidence that engagement only leads to more trauma. They're not being irrational or weak. They're being empirical, drawing logical conclusions from the data of their own experience. The tragedy is that this logic is unassailable but also paralyzing. If the past proves that fighting is futile and sacrifice meaningless, then what's left except survival for its own sake? And if survival is the only goal, then cowardice becomes not just acceptable, but rational. Why take risks? Why endure pain? Why sacrifice yourself for causes that history suggests won't matter in 1,000 years anyway? This is the prison that memory builds for perpetuals. Not walls of stone or bars of iron, but walls of recollection and bars of trauma. A prison that goes with them everywhere they go, that cannot be escaped through flight or fighting, that can only be endured. And for some, endurance means cowardice, means hiding from anything that might add new suffering to the vast archive of pain they already carry, means choosing the smallest, quietest life possible in hopes that maybe, just maybe, they can avoid making things worse. Cowardice versus wisdom, the Immortal's dilemma. There's a question that haunts every discussion of the immortal cowards in Warhammer 40,000. Is their retreat actually cowardice, or is it wisdom? When you've lived for tens of thousands of years and seen the futility of war played out across countless conflicts, is refusing to fight the next one a moral failing or a reasonable conclusion based on overwhelming evidence? Traditional notions of courage assume a relatively limited time frame. A soldier is brave because he stands his ground in battle despite the risk of death. But this bravery presupposes that the battle matters, that the outcome will make some meaningful difference, that the sacrifice serves a purpose worth dying for. What happens to courage when you've seen 100 battles that seemed important at the time, but meant nothing in the long run. Olanius Person fought for 45,000 years. He served in countless wars, stood his ground in battle after battle, proved his courage more times than any mortal could imagine. At what point does one more demonstration of courage become redundant? At what point is the brave thing actually to walk away, to refuse participation in a cycle of violence that never ends and never accomplishes anything permanent? Consider his perspective. He fought at Verdun, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. 300,000 men died. Millions more were wounded. Years of horrific combat across a few miles of devastated ground. And what did it accomplish? World War I ended eventually, but its conclusion led directly to the conditions that caused World War II. The problems weren't solved, they were just postponed. All those deaths, all that suffering, and humanity still went right back to slaughtering itself a generation later. Now multiply that experience across dozens, hundreds, thousands of wars. Some large-scale like the Unification Wars that consumed entire continents. Some small-scale like border skirmishes between minor kingdoms. All of them convinced of their own importance at the time, all of them fading into historical footnotes after the fact. What conclusion would you draw? That war solves problems? Or that war just creates new problems that lead to more war? From this perspective, Olanius Person's retreat to Calth to become a farmer looks less like cowardice and more like wisdom. He'd done his part. He'd fought his wars. He'd proven his courage and fulfilled his duty more completely than any mortal could. Why should he be obligated to fight again? Why should his immortality condemn him to an endless cycle of violence when normal humans get to retire after one lifetime of service? There's also the question of effectiveness. Olanius Person was always just a soldier, never a leader or strategic genius. His participation in any given war was functionally irrelevant to its outcome. One more lasgun in the line, one more body in the ranks. Brave, certainly, but not decisive. If his contribution doesn't materially affect the outcome, is he morally obligated to make it? Or is discretion, the choice to preserve himself rather than waste his life in yet another pointless conflict, actually the wiser choice? The Emperor of mankind took a different approach. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that he could guide humanity toward a better future, that his actions mattered, that the wars he waged served a purpose beyond themselves. But the Emperor also failed catastrophically. His great crusade ended in the Horus heresy. His Imperium became a tyrannical nightmare. His vision of human ascension devolved into stagnation and superstition. After 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, barely alive, maintaining a rotting empire through sheer force of will, has he accomplished anything that justifies the cost? Erda thought the Emperor was wrong, that his methods were too ruthless and his vision too narrow. So she betrayed him and hid. Was she right? Her scattering of the Primarchs undeniably made things worse, directly contributing to the Horus heresy and all the horrors that followed. But her core criticism of the Emperor, that he'd become a tyrant pursuing power for its own sake, arguably had merit. The Imperium that survived the heresy is exactly the kind of authoritarian nightmare she feared. So who was right? The Emperor who fought and failed, or Erda who fled and failed? Neither one achieved what they wanted. The Emperor wanted human ascension and got endless war. Erda wanted freedom for her sons and got them twisted into weapons anyway, just weapons for chaos instead of the Imperium. Both of them could have claimed the moral high ground. Both of them ended up contributing to catastrophe. Maybe that's the point. Maybe in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no right answers. Maybe courage and cowardice, engagement and retreat, fighting and hiding, all lead to the same ultimate outcome, suffering and death and the slow grinding down of hope. Maybe the only real choice is how you want to spend the time you have, whether that time is one lifetime or 45,000 years. From this perspective, Olanius Person's cowardice starts to look reasonable. If fighting doesn't solve anything and heroism doesn't make a difference, Why not choose comfort? Why not prioritize your own peace of mind over abstract notions of duty? You've already given more than any person should have to give. You've already sacrificed more than anyone could reasonably ask. What do you owe to a universe that's only ever repaid your service with pain? But there's a counter-argument that's equally compelling. If everyone with power and ability chose to hide, to retreat, to prioritize their own comfort over the common good, then tyranny and chaos would reign unopposed. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. By hiding on Kalth, by refusing to engage with the conflicts shaping the galaxy, Olanius' person enabled the very wars he was trying to avoid. His retreat created a vacuum that others filled, often with worse results than if he'd stayed engaged. This is the Immortal's dilemma. Fight knowing it won't matter, or retreat knowing your absence might make things worse. Endure more trauma to potentially reduce suffering for others, or preserve your own sanity at their expense. Neither choice is clearly right. Neither choice is clearly wrong. You just have to pick which failure you can live with. John Grammaticus chose a different path entirely. He wanted to die, not to retreat into comfortable obscurity like Olanius, or to hide in exile like Erda, but to end his existence completely. He looked at the Immortal's dilemma and decided the only winning move was not to play. Death would solve everything, ending both the obligation to fight and the guilt of retreat. But he couldn't die, or at least couldn't stay dead. His manufactured immortality denied him even that escape. So he was forced back into the game, back into service, back into the cycle of compromise and guilt that had driven him to suicide in the first place. You could argue this was justice, that he deserved to suffer for his failures. Or you could argue it was cruelty, forcing someone who'd reached their breaking point to continue on past it. Either way, it wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. The wisdom versus cowardice question ultimately comes down to perspective and time frame. Over the short term, within a single human lifetime, courage looks like standing and fighting, facing danger rather than fleeing from it, sacrificing yourself for causes greater than yourself. But over the long term, across thousands of years, courage starts to look futile. You've already stood and fought. You've already faced danger and sacrificed yourself. Doing it, again, doesn't prove anything. It just creates more trauma, more pain, more memories to carry. So maybe wisdom for an immortal means knowing when enough is enough, means recognizing that you've given all you can reasonably be expected to give, and that further sacrifice won't change anything. Means choosing life, even a reduced and hidden life, over the pointless glory of one more heroic last stand. From this perspective, the immortal cowards aren't cowards at all. They're realists. They're the only ones who've lived long enough to see through the lies that keep mortals fighting. But there's a darker reading too. Maybe calling it wisdom is just rationalization. Maybe it's cowardice dressed up in philosophical justification. Maybe the real test of character is whether you keep fighting even when you know it's futile, whether you maintain hope even when hope is irrational, whether you act as if your choices matter even when evidence suggests they don't. Maybe the immortal cowards are failures precisely because they let experience drain away their idealism, their belief that things can get better, their willingness to try. This ambiguity is intentional. Warhammer 40,000 doesn't do simple morality. It doesn't offer clear answers about right and wrong. In a universe where there is only war, where hope is the first step on the road to disappointment, where the only certainty is suffering, how could there be clear answers? The immortal cowards exist in that moral grey zone, neither purely right nor purely wrong, neither admirable nor contemptible. They're just beings trying to survive in a universe designed to crush them. And if that survival requires retreat, requires hiding, requires what mortals might call cowardice, then so be it. The question isn't whether they're brave or cowardly. The question is whether you, the audience, can understand why they made the choices they did. Can you imagine living for 45,000 years and still wanting to fight? Can you imagine experiencing that much trauma and still maintaining hope? Can you imagine watching everything you love turn to dust over and over again and still forming new attachments? If you can, then maybe the immortal cowards really are failures. But if you can't, if you think you'd eventually reach a breaking point too, then maybe they're just honest. Maybe they're the ones brave enough to admit that they're done. The final stand of a coward. The strangest thing about immortal cowards in Warhammer 40,000 is that many of them die as heroes. Their entire lives, or at least their recent centuries, spent in retreat and hiding, culminating in moments of extraordinary courage. It's as if all that accumulated cowardice was building towards something, concentrating into a single act that would redeem or at least complicate their legacy. Olanius Persson spent 18 years on Calth, trying to be nobody. When the word-bearers attacked, he ran. He fled through time and space, with his little band of refugees, using an athami to cut through reality and avoid the conflicts consuming the galaxy. He was running from the Horus heresy, from his duty, from everything that being a perpetual might obligate him to do. He was the eternal soldier who'd finally had enough, who just wanted to survive this one last catastrophe and find somewhere quiet to wait out the storm. But he didn't make it, or rather, he made it exactly where he needed to be, but not where he wanted to be. His journey through time and space, guided by a mysterious spool of thread that he believed his future self had sent to mark the path, led him directly to the vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, during the final confrontation between the Emperor and the traitor Warmaster. This is important. Olanius Persson didn't plan to be there. He wasn't answering a call to glory or rushing toward battle. He was trying to reach Terra through the back roads of reality, and those roads happened to deposit him in the exact place and time where the fate of the Imperium would be decided. Circumstance, or perhaps fate, or maybe just the cruelest of cosmic jokes, put the immortal coward in the position to become a legend. When Olanius materialized in Lupercal's court on the vengeful spirit, he found the Emperor unconscious, wounded by Horus, who had become something far beyond a mere primarch. The Warmaster had accepted the full power of all four Chaos gods, transforming into a horrific entity of pure malevolence. He'd already mortally wounded the Emperor in their duel. One more blow would finish it. Olanius Persson had a choice. He could hide. The Emperor was down. Horus was distracted. There was probably a way out, some corner to retreat into, some means of escape. After 45,000 years of running from conflicts just like this, the instinct to flee must have been overwhelming. Everything in his nature, everything in his recent experience screamed at him to get away, to survive, to let someone else be the hero. Instead, he stood between Horus and the Emperor. Olanius Persson, who'd spent centuries trying to be invisible, who'd hidden on Calth and fled through time to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation, put himself in harm's way. He faced down a being of godlike power armed with nothing but a lasgun and faith. He demanded that Horus step back, that the Warmaster not touch the Emperor, and when Horus ignored him, Olanius opened fire. A lasgun against a chaos-empowered demigod is laughable. It's like throwing pebbles at a mountain. The shots did nothing, didn't even scratch Horus's warped armor. But Olanius fired anyway, because sometimes the point isn't whether you can win. The point is that you stand, that you fight, that you refuse to let evil triumph unopposed even when opposition is futile. Horus killed him with contemptuous ease. A single swipe of his talons reduced Olanius Persson to red mist, completely destroying the Perpetual's body beyond any possibility of regeneration. After 45,000 years of surviving every battle, every catastrophe, every attempt on his life, Olanius Persson died. And he died not fighting for a cause he believed in or protecting someone he loved, but simply because it was the right thing to do in that moment. The significance of Ol's death cannot be overstated. By standing between Horus and the Emperor, by buying those few crucial seconds, he allowed the Emperor to recover enough to strike back. Before killing Olanius, Horus had held back slightly, some tiny remnant of the being he'd once been preventing him from unleashing his full power against his father. But in killing Olanius, a mere mortal who posed no threat, Horus revealed the complete corruption of his soul. There was nothing left of the noble warrior he'd once been. He was pure chaos now, pure evil, and that realization freed the Emperor to do what he'd been reluctant to do before, completely destroy his beloved son. The Emperor unleashed the full force of his psychic might, burning away Horus's soul so completely that even the Chaos gods couldn't resurrect him. The War Master died, the heresy's leader was gone, and while the damage had been done, while the Imperium would never recover from the civil war, at least the immediate threat was ended. All because Olanius Person, the immortal coward who'd spent 45,000 years avoiding exactly this kind of sacrifice, chose to stand. In his final moment, he wasn't a coward. He wasn't even particularly brave. He was just a man doing what needed to be done. Consequences be damned. John Grammaticus's story has similar notes. After losing his immortality by using the fulgurite to heal Vulcan, after being held prisoner by Daemon Prytanis to ensure he'd complete the Cabal's final mission, John found himself on Terra during the siege. He'd run from responsibility, tried to die, desperately sought any escape from his obligations. But in the end, he too ended up exactly where he needed to be, in Lupercal's court alongside Olanius Person. The details are fragmentary, accounts vary. But what's clear is that John was there, was part of the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus. At some point, he used Enuncia, the language of creation itself, to speak a word of power that briefly incapacitated Horus. This gave others, including Olanius, the opening they needed to act. Then Olanius, recognizing that John had knowledge and abilities that might be needed in the future, demanded that John flee and travel back in time to complete their mission. So John Grammaticus, who'd wanted nothing more than to die and escape his obligations, was given a direct order by a dying perpetual to live, to run, to survive. And he obeyed, because what else could he do? Olanius was dying to give him the chance to escape. Refusing would make that sacrifice meaningless. So the coward who'd stepped out an airlock hoping for oblivion ran once more. But this time, he was running, towards something rather than away from it. Both Olanius and John complicate the simple narrative of cowardice. Yes, they ran. Yes, they hid. Yes, they spent centuries or millennia trying to avoid the responsibilities that their immortality might impose on them. But when the moment came, when circumstances put them in a position where they could make a difference, they acted. Not perfectly, not without fear, but they acted. This doesn't erase their cowardice. Olanius's final stand doesn't change the fact that he spent 18 years hiding on Calth and more years fleeing through time. John's use of Enuncia against Horus doesn't change his suicide attempt or his 1,000 years of service to alien masters. They were cowards, but they were also heroes, in the end. The two things can coexist in the same person, in the same life, in the same immortal being who's had 45,000 years to be both. Maybe that's the real lesson of the immortal cowards, that bravery and cowardice aren't fixed character traits. They're choices, made moment to moment, circumstance to circumstance. You can be brave for 40,000 years and then decide you've had enough. You can be a coward for centuries and then find something worth dying for. The length of your life doesn't determine your character. The choices you make do. Olanius Person chose to farm on Calth. He chose to flee when the word-bearers attacked. He chose to avoid direct confrontation during the heresy. All cowardly choices in a sense. But he also chose to stand against Horus. That last choice doesn't erase the others, but it recontextualizes them. Maybe he wasn't running from duty. Maybe he was just waiting for a moment where his sacrifice would actually matter. where standing and fighting would accomplish something beyond adding to his trauma collection. Or maybe not. Maybe he really was just a coward who got unlucky, who ended up in a situation where there was no escape and chose to die well rather than die cowering. Maybe his final stand wasn't redemption, just the best death available to someone who'd been trying to avoid death for 45,000 years. We don't know. We can't know. He's dead, completely destroyed, and he can't explain his reasoning. What we do know is that the Imperium venerates Olanius Pius, the mythic version of his story, as the ultimate example of human courage. A mere mortal standing against a godlike enemy to protect the Emperor. The Order of Olanius Pius is the highest military honor the Imperial Guard can bestow. His image appears on regimental banners across the Imperium. He's a saint, a legend, an inspiration to billions. And the real Olanius person would probably find that hilarious, or horrifying, or maybe both. He didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to be a farmer. He didn't want glory. He wanted peace. Everything he spent 18 years trying to escape became his defining legacy. The coward who ran became the hero who stood. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that irony is probably the kindest joke the universe can manage. Living with immortality in the 41st millennium. The question that haunts all discussions of perpetuals in Warhammer 40,000 is, where are they now? In the 31st millennium, during the Horus heresy, perpetuals seemed relatively common. Olanius, John, Erda, Olivia Soreka, Daemon Pritanis, and others played roles in shaping events. But by the 41st millennium, they've seemingly vanished. No perpetuals openly walk among the Imperium's citizens. No immortal counselors guide the High Lords of Terror. The perpetuals have disappeared. Some died, certainly. Olanius' person was reduced to mist by Horus. Erda was killed by Erebus's Athami. Fulgurite and similar weapons can permanently end a perpetual's life. But not all of them died. Some must have survived the heresy and its aftermath. So where are they? What happened to humanity's immortals? The most likely answer is that they're hiding. After watching the Imperium tear itself apart in the Horus heresy, after seeing the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne and his vision of human ascension collapse into theocratic tyranny, the surviving perpetuals probably decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They went to ground, disappeared into obscurity, and have stayed hidden for the last 10,000 years. Think about what the 41st Millennium Imperium looks like to beings who remember the age of technology, the Great Crusade, the early dreams of what humanity might become. It's a nightmare, a brutal, ignorant, superstitious empire that burns its own people as heretics and witches. That has forgotten most of the scientific knowledge that once made humanity great. That worships the Emperor as a god despite his explicit rejection of that concept. That treats human life as the cheapest of resources, spending billions of soldiers like currency in endless wars. To a perpetual who remembers better times, the Imperium of the 41st millennium is a horrific parody of what it was supposed to be. Everything the Emperor tried to prevent, everything he fought against, has come to pass anyway. The theocracy, the ignorance, the stagnation. The Imperium has become exactly the kind of regime that perpetuals like Erda feared. Oppressive, unchanging, grinding human potential into dust beneath its bureaucratic boot. Why would any perpetual want to be part of that? Why would they reveal themselves to an inquisition that would see them as either heretics to be burned or resources to be exploited? Better to hide, to live quietly, to avoid attention, and survive however they can. The Imperium doesn't deserve the guidance of immortals, and the immortals don't deserve the torment of trying to fix something so fundamentally broken. Consider what it would mean to be immortal in the 41st millennium. You couldn't stay in one place for more than a few decades without people noticing you don't age. You'd have to constantly move, changing identities, cutting ties before anyone realized what you were. Every friendship would be temporary. Every home would be provisional. You'd be perpetually alone, even in the midst of humanity's trillion-strong population. And you'd be hunted. The Inquisition would definitely want to find you if they knew you existed. Perpetual regeneration could be studied, weaponized, used to create super soldiers or extend the lives of important officials. Your body would become a resource, something to be exploited for the Imperium's benefit. You'd go from being a free individual to being a prisoner in some secret inquisitorial facility, dissected and studied for centuries while they tried to replicate your abilities. Or worse, you might end up serving the Imperium, forced into eternal service as an agent or assassin or diplomat. Your immortality used to justify putting you in the most dangerous situations. After all, you can't really die, so why not send you on suicide missions? Why not use you until you break, then put you back together and use you again? Your refusal to age becomes a curse, proof that you can endure more than any mortal. Therefore, you should endure more. From this perspective, hiding isn't cowardice. It's survival. It's the only rational response to an Imperium that would consume you if it knew what you were. The Perpetuals who survived into the 41st Millennium are the wise ones, the ones who learned from the disasters of the heresy that immortals can't save humanity from itself, that engaging with power structures that vast and that corrupt only leads to being corrupted or destroyed yourself. But there's another possibility, that some Perpetuals did engage, that they're out there, quietly working to improve things from positions of obscurity. Maybe one is a tech priest on Mars, slowly trying to recover lost knowledge. Maybe another is a rogue trader, using the freedom of the frontier to advance humanity's interests. Maybe a third is embedded in the Officio Assassinorum, eliminating the Imperium's worst excesses one target at a time. These hidden heroes, if they exist, would be the anti-cowards, still hiding their nature, still concealing their immortality, but using their long lifespans to actually make a difference. Slowly, carefully, building towards some distant goal that mortals couldn't achieve because they don't have enough time. This would be cowardice, transformed into strategy, hiding that serves a purpose beyond mere survival. We don't know if such Perpetuals exist. The lore is deliberately vague about the fate of immortals in the 41st Millennium. Maybe they're all dead. Maybe they're all hiding. Maybe some are actively working for change, while others have given up. The ambiguity is the point. In a universe as vast and secretive as Warhammer 40,000, there's room for immortals to exist without anyone knowing. What we can be certain of is that if Perpetuals do exist in the 41st Millennium, they're not the confident, powerful beings they were in the 31st. They're fugitives, refugees. Cowards, perhaps, but cowards with good reason. The galaxy has gotten worse, not better. The Imperium is even more oppressive than it was during the heresy. The threats to humanity have multiplied. Any rational immortal would look at the current state of affairs and decide that the best strategy is to keep their heads down and survive. And maybe that is cowardice. Maybe the right thing to do would be to reveal themselves, to use their knowledge and abilities to fight for change. But 10,000 years of watching the Imperium get worse despite everyone's best efforts is a pretty convincing argument that change isn't possible, that the Imperium's decay is inexorable, that trying to fix it would just waste your immortal life in futile efforts that accomplish nothing. So they hide, they survive, they watch from the shadows as the Imperium grinds toward its inevitable doom, and when it finally falls, when the structures that made hiding necessary collapse, maybe then they'll emerge. Maybe then they'll try to guide whatever comes next. Or maybe they'll just keep hiding, having learned that immortality's curse is watching everything you try to build fall apart, and that the only winning move is not to build anything at all. This is the ultimate fate of the immortal coward in Warhammer 40,000. Not death, which at least has finality, but endless hiding, endless survival, endless witness to a universe that gets worse no matter what you do. The cowardice becomes permanent, not because they lack courage, but because courage has been proven useless. What's left is just existing, just enduring, just surviving one more day in hopes that maybe tomorrow will be different, even though every yesterday has taught you it won't be. That's the true horror of immortal cowardice. Not that it's wrong, but that it might be right. That maybe, in a universe where there is only war, the wisest course is to run, to hide, to preserve yourself and let the galaxy burn, because it's going to burn anyway. And at least this way, you don't have to feel the flames quite so keenly. It's a grim calculus, trading heroism for survival, duty for safety, meaning for mere existence. But when you're immortal, existence might be all you can really hope for. Everything else, glory, purpose, love, legacy, all of it fades with time. All of it ends in loss and pain and trauma added to the vast collection you already carry. The only thing that endures is you, assuming you can endure, assuming you can keep running and hiding and surviving, despite the weight of millennia pressing down on you. That's what it means to be an immortal coward in the 41st millennium. Not brave, not heroic, but alive. Still alive. After everything, despite everything, impossibly, unbearably, wretchedly alive. Conclusion. The immortal cowards of Warhammer 40,000 are perhaps the most tragically human characters in a universe designed to crush humanity. They're beings who've lived long enough to see through the lies that sustain normal life, the lies about meaning and purpose and the value of sacrifice. They know, with the certainty that only millennia of experience can provide, that wars accomplish nothing permanent, that causes fade into irrelevance, that heroism is just another word for futile gesture. And armed with that knowledge, they make the choice that anyone might make if they thought about it too much. They run. Olanius Persson ran for 45,000 years before circumstance forced him to stand. John Grammaticus tried to run from life itself, only to discover that death was denied to him. Erda ran from the consequences of her own actions, hiding in exile while the galaxy paid the price for her choices. All of them cowards by conventional definition. All of them sympathetic once you understand their reasoning. Because that's the thing about immortality in Warhammer 40,000. It's not a gift, it's a curse. It's the sentence of eternal witness to suffering you can't prevent, loss you can't avoid, and pain you can't forget. The perpetuals who chose cowardice weren't weak. They were tired. They'd given everything they had to give, suffered everything they could stand to suffer, and they'd reached the point where one more war, one more sacrifice, one more attempt to make things better was simply too much to ask. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. For mortals, that means a lifetime of struggle that at least has an endpoint. Death comes eventually, offering peace if not victory. But for perpetuals, war is truly endless. No escape through death, no respite through madness, just eternity stretching out before them, filled with conflict and suffering and the slow erosion of everything that makes existence bearable. Is it cowardice to run from that? Or is it sanity? Is it weakness to want peace after 45,000 years of war? Or is it the only reasonable response to an unreasonable situation? The galaxy will judge the immortal cowards as it judges all things, harshly and without understanding. But perhaps we can afford to be more charitable. Perhaps we can recognize that cowardice, when it comes from beings who've proven their courage across millennia, is not a moral failing, but a breaking point reached. The immortal cowards of Warhammer 40,000 remind us that courage is not unlimited, that duty can be fulfilled and then set aside, that survival, mere survival, is sometimes the only victory available. They're cowards, yes, but they're honest cowards, refusing to pretend that one more battle will matter, that one more sacrifice will change anything, that heroism is anything more than a waste of an immortal life. In the end, Olanius Persson stood against Horus, not because he stopped being a coward, but because even cowards can find moments worth dying for. His final stand doesn't erase his flight, but it contextualizes it. He wasn't running from duty. He was waiting for a moment when his death would actually accomplish something. And when that moment came, when 45,000 years of cowardice finally led him to a death with meaning, he took it. Maybe that's the real lesson, that cowardice and courage aren't opposites, but points on a spectrum that immortals traverse repeatedly across their eternal lives. You can be brave and then become a coward. You can be a coward and then find courage. The length of your existence gives you room to be both, to embody contradictions, to change your mind about what matters based on accumulated experience. The grim life of an immortal coward is one of flight, hiding, and desperate attempts to escape the unbearable burden of eternal witness. But it's also a life of survival against impossible odds, of endurance in the face of cosmic horror, of clinging to existence even when existence offers nothing but pain. These are beings who've lived longer than any human should have to live, who've endured more than any mind should have to hold, who've sacrificed more than any cause could justify demanding. And they're still here, still alive, still running, still hiding, still surviving, despite everything the universe throws at them. That takes a kind of courage too. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of simply continuing, of refusing to give up even when giving up seems like the only rational choice, of enduring one more day, one more year, one more millennium, in the faint hope that maybe, eventually, the suffering will end. It never does, of course. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and the war never ends. But the immortal cowards keep running anyway, keep hiding anyway, keep surviving anyway, because what else can they do? They're trapped in immortal flesh, condemned to witness a universe that offers only suffering, and their only power is to choose where they witness it from. So they run, they hide, they become the immortal cowards of Warhammer 40,000, neither heroes nor villains, but beings too broken by experience to be anything except tired. And in a universe that crushes hope and devours heroes, maybe being tired is the most honest response. Maybe the cowards are the only ones who figured out the truth, that in the grim darkness of the far future, survival is the only victory you can really hope for. And if surviving requires cowardice, then perhaps cowardice is wisdom after all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the grim existence of Warhammer 40K's immortal cowards, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of the 40K universe, bringing you lore, analysis, and stories from the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, remember that in a universe of only war, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is survive.